My goodness, Olivia, how many people do we have out in the world tonight? Over 100 people are joining us, but we are so thrilled to have you all here tonight. I'm Catherine Allgor. I'm the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, where we are committed to bringing interesting people all together to talk about the complexities of history and to share thoughts, observations, and ideas. We're able to do that because of the support of friends like you. And I want to thank, I know that Marshall Moriarty is here, Jim Siegel, Hillary Rayport. Am I missing a board member? But these are our trustees. Oh, Ted Whitmer. Yeah, I see Ted as well. Thank you so much for being here, supporting what we do, and taking such good care of us. So I've been looking forward to this conversation with Drew Gilpin Faust. And I know that you're going to hear all kinds of fascinating stories. And here at the MHS, we believe that history is stories, but not just stories, but a collection of life experiences that shape our understanding of the world. And tonight, we're reflecting on Drew's still new book, I'm going to call it, which is Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Midcentury, discussing the formative experiences of her youth and to think about the lesson of history. So this evening, I am honored to be in conversation with Drew Gilpin Faust. She is the President Emerita of Harvard University and the Arthur Kingsley Porter University Professor. She's the author of 7 books, including this one, and the award-winning This Republic of Suffering, Death and the American Civil War. Drew received awards in 1982 and 96 for distinguished teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1994, the Society of American Historians in 1993, and the American Philosophical Society in 2004. And she was awarded the John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, which I just love the title of that, The Study of Humanity, by the Library of Congress in 2018. So I invite you to sit back and enjoy the conversation as we listen to some stories about the past. Drew Gilpin Faust, everybody.
Thank you, Catherine. That was very generous, and thanks to all of you for being here. I want to apologize in advance. I've had laryngitis for over, 2 weeks now. So if you listen to my audiobook, I don't sound like my audiobook, but I did read my audiobook, so don't say it's a fake. I'm the fake tonight. But I'm very excited to be here nonetheless, to have a chance to share thoughts with Catherine and then to hear your questions later on.
Oh, thank you so much. I know. Which one is AI? We got the real thing here. I've decided cliches are cliche for a reason. I'm going to start with a cliche, with an epigram, and you got all the good ones by James Baldwin. But I was reading your book. We are of similar generations, but not the same. And I was struck by the novelist L.H. Hartley, The Past is a Foreign Country. Here is a past that is with a living memory of many of us, and yet, it is a foreign country. And what's extraordinary about this book, I think, so before I put you on the spot with questions, I'm going to put you on the spot with just saying how great this book is. It is a memoir, and of course there's something so compelling about a memoir, but it's a memoir by a historian. And because of that, there is an interweaving of the larger discipline with the memory in such an evocative way. I'm going to give you my highest word of praise for a book by a historian. It is writerly. Yes, it is a writerly book. But let's get started into some of the themes and the ideas in this book. And because we are sitting in one of America's great archives, the Massachusetts Historical Society, let's start with a document, and it's one you found in an archive, and it's the one you open your book with. And just in case you've forgotten what it is, in fact, your letter to the president. So I wonder if you would tell us about this letter, and then also what the experience of finding it in the archive was.
This is a letter that I wrote in 1957, and it came about because I was being driven home from school in Virginia, where I grew up, segregated Virginia, in the aftermath of the Brown v. Board decision by the Supreme Court that mandated that school integration should take place. And yet, Virginia that was resisting that. And I was 9 years old, and I was sitting in the car with this African-American man who was driving me home. And the radio began to speak about debates in Virginia about whether all schools should be closed, which was the position the white supremacist government of Virginia was taking in face of Brown v. Board. And the debate I was hearing on the radio was, should all schools be closed as a way of showing that Virginia will not bow to the federal government and integrate its schools? And I was listening to this with great bewilderment because it had never occurred to me before that my all-white school was all-white by anything but accident. And so the idea that it was actually a policy and a law, this was astonishing to me. So I asked the African-American man, his name was Rayfield, he worked for our family, I knew him very well. I asked him, is it true that black people can't come to my school? I would have said colored people in 1957. Can't come to my school. He said not a word. And then I said, if I painted my face black, I couldn't go to school tomorrow. He said not a word. And his silence was more expressive than almost any answer he could have given me. And so I was outraged, and I thought about all the values of Christianity that I had been taught as a child who was sent to Sunday school every week. I thought about the values of the Declaration of Independence that I'd been taught about in school. And so I went home and I wrote to the president. And I told the president that it's a very high-handed letter. I was a bossy little girl, and I was bossing President Eisenhower and telling him that he needed to make sure that integration happened and that Christ believed that all people, yellow, brown, and red, were equal before God, and that students should be able to go to schools regardless of their race or color. And I end the letter with an entreaty saying, please, Mr. President, please make sure that colored people can go to schools and other things. That's pretty much a quote. And I sent this off to the president and received a routine answer from some lackey in the White House. So as I grew up, I always told this story that I'd written to the president. And in the early 2000s, I was asked to contribute to a volume of personal reflections by historians of the American South, of which by the early 2000s I was one. And I thought, well, I should talk about this letter. And then I thought, did I invent it? Did I make it up because it was a past that was kind of redemptive? It's a little bit like saying that everybody was a member of the French Resistance. And so I thought, well, you're a historian. You ought to be able to find that letter if you indeed wrote such a letter to the president. So I wrote off to the National Archives, and I'd never worked in 20th century history, so it didn't occur to me that I ought to be writing to the Presidential Library. But they directed me to the Eisenhower Library in Kansas, and I remember to this day sitting on an airplane and looking at what was then my BlackBerry and seeing a message from a librarian
My gosh.
at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, and he said, we have found your letter, and it says that President Eisenhower should support integration. And I, whatever you called it then, it wasn't texted. I don't know what you did with the BlackBerry. I BlackBerried back and said, could you please send me a copy? Now, of course, he couldn't download it or attach it. That was too early technologically for that. So I waited with bated breath. What did I say? And the letter came, and there it is. It's reproduced in my little crabbed 9-year-old handwriting. It's in the front of the book and is a kind of, I don't know, emblem of some of the trouble I started making early on, at least in the eyes of my family, who were horrified when the letter from even the acknowledgement from the White House came. They said, what did you write? What have you been doing? So.
And we can't see it, of course, but you can see it's on lined paper, so that made sure your writing was nice and straight. Mm-hmm. Very struck by the fact that when you look at the signature, it's quite obvious you wrote Drew Gilpin, and then you added Catherine, which I did not even know we share our first name. But but I thought that was kind of interesting.
You can see by the way the letters are placed
Yeah.
that I was always called Drew. I was named. There are a lot of Southern, I don't know if you have friends who are Southern women, but often they have like these non-used first names and then a family kind of middle name that is what they're called.
Right.
I was always called Drew, but my father said I should have Catherine in front because my mother was a Catherine, her mother was a Catherine, her mother was a Catherine. So there's Catherine. And I added it to this letter, and my speculation, I don't remember why, but my speculation is I wanted Eisenhower to know that I was a girl. And I felt if I wrote Drew Gilpin, I'd get a response to Mr. Gilpin,
Yeah.
and it would be cataloged in the Eisenhower Library
Yes.
as Mr. Gilpin. So
There you go.
I wanted to be who I was.
Catherine Drew. Yes, I like it. I was thinking as I was reading, especially that part as when you were a child. So there's a value in our culture that we now talk about openly that I don't remember talking about 20 years ago, which is empathy. And one of the sort of words in public history that we talk about, or in history education, is the development of historical empathy. And the theory is that if we can look back and understand the people of the past as human beings, not heroes or villains, but actual human beings, that we almost work that empathic muscle, and maybe we could bring that to some of the others in our own world. And I just was struck by how empathic you were as a child, and that it was transferable. So you write about clashing with your mother mostly, about the gender restrictions and the feeling in your family of things not being fair. And it was because you were treated differently than your brothers, and that wasn't fair. And that's something a child, obviously, you know, it's all about you, and you. But you transferred that quite early by sitting and listening to the feeling of that the world around you wasn't fair. And I saw that in your curiosity around that, and I think that just never stopped.
Well, it's such an interesting point you make about history and empathy, because I've spent my historical life essentially writing about privileged white Southerners in the pre-Civil War period. My first book was about people who defended slavery. And then I wrote a book about a completely hateful South Carolina planter. But I didn't want to just write a book to say, this man is hateful. I've wanted to understand how people can have perspectives that seem to us so unimaginable in our own time. And what was it that enabled them to get up in the morning and live with themselves and to explain to themselves what they were doing in terms of this pro-slavery argument or in terms of this planter? How did he think that owning other human beings was an acceptable way to live? And I think this is a very important thing for students to think about, because I am certain that there are things we're doing now that people in the future will look back on and say, how could you have, and one example I often think of, because my daughter's a vegetarian, is how could you eat meat? And how could you allow climate change? How can you, many things that our society is enabling, tolerating, embracing right now, that I hope historical exploration can enable us to interrogate and challenge based on how we understand how people in the past came to accept what we now see as unacceptable. So
yeah.
I think that's been an important element in what I have considered to be the significance of historical writing. But you also asked, how was it that I developed empathy for people around me as a child? And I do think something you noted, which is that I had three brothers and I felt they had all kinds of privileges that I didn't, made me feel more aware of other people who had even less privilege, less equality than I did in a quite privileged family, where it was simply that I couldn't, I had to wear little lacy panties and they didn't. Now, this was a cause for great outrage when I was a little child, but it hardly compares to the racial injustices that were operating all around me and became quite visible to me as I began to get older.
Yeah, but you could still see the structure of life. You were just beginning to be an intellectual. The fact that you identify yourself in that little letter from the 9-year-old you as white it's understanding that, because a lot of people have family dynamics and they don't necessarily see it in that structural way. And maybe along that theme, I'd like to talk about your relationship with your mother. And first I want to say I'm so sorry that you lost your mother when you were just a young woman in college. And she was a young woman. Now, of course, we're all past her age. And what's so sad about that to me is that you lost, both of you, mother and daughter, lost those times of reconciliation where you could begin to understand each other. And I was so really compelled by your mother, and I was reminded of, in the 19th century, the suffragists who were trying to get women to vote, and they're out there and they're picketing and they're da-da-da-da, would express frustration not about the men who were opposing them, but the white, middle-class, and elite women who were actually resisting their efforts. And they would say, why are they basically clinging to their oppression? And that dynamic that white women have a lot was carrying out, I saw, through your mother's life, because she was at once incredibly strong and intelligent, and in a different milieu would have gone a different way, but she was also like incredibly strict on you about, her view of the world.
So my mother said to me quite often, it's a man's world, sweetie, and the sooner you figure that out, the better off you'll be. And she thought it was very important that I understand that, but there was always a tone of anger when she said this to me, when she emphasized it, because I think she had subjected herself to that assumption, thought that I needed to. This was the era of life adjustment. This was like the prevailing psychology, is that education should encourage children to be well-adjusted.
Well-adjusted.
She wanted me to be well-adjusted. I was not well-adjusted. I was a pain. And she was sort of saying to me, I've become well-adjusted. But there was a bit of a gritting of the teeth, as she said it. And I think that was the story of her life. She put herself in a position as a wife and mother and constrained all the other things that mattered to her and resented that. Now, my mother was not ever a person who thought about a career. She was not well educated. She barely graduated from high school, maybe didn't graduate from high school. She was at Miss Hall School, and then she left and went to Italy, and I don't think that could really be called a senior year of high school.
No.
And I think she probably had some kind of dyslexia of a sort.
Yeah.
And she inhabited the world through emotion and intuition. And I was this little philosopher, and I was always arguing with her and saying, that's not reasonable. That doesn't make sense. And I'd present these syllogisms to her about why I should be able to do whatever it was I thought I should be able to do. And she'd just say, you'll do what I say because I said so. And that was the cause for warfare. But she died at age 47. I think she was an adult anorexic. She was extremely thin. She was about 5'9" and weighed around 90 pounds. And we just didn't pay attention to it. It's kind of astonishing to me that, well, maybe we children shouldn't have been expected to, but certainly I think my father and others around her should have intervened more. But people didn't think about those kinds of illnesses in that era. And so her life was very foreshortened. And in the book, I talk about Betty Friedan. I think this is an example of how I try to situate my own story in a broader story. Feminine Mystique was published in 1963. My mother died in 1966. I doubt she ever read it. But Betty Friedan had a theory about the forfeited self, women who subjected themselves to these strictures of femininity and domesticity and gave themselves up, their own selves up, for the selves of their husband and children. And that completely describes my mother. But it was as if she didn't just forfeit herself, she forfeited her body as she starved to death, essentially, and died at such an early age. So it's a very sad story that I think writing about was in some ways liberatory for me. You said we never reconciled. I had a giant fight with her right before she got extremely sick. for the very last time, like 2 days before she died. And so she died with this, I had my mouth open with my next argument, and she got carted off to the hospital and died. So I think writing about it was an act of reconciliation many, many, many decades later.
Good. I'm glad that at least on this side you had that. Yeah, and it's also, I have to also say, she probably got lots of compliments on how slim she was. I mean, this is the problem with that kind of...
She was a little excessively slim.
Yeah. So you didn't grow up in a world of women, though you and your mother, I think, constellated a little universe right there. But then you had the experience of going to Concord Academy, and not only were you in a world of women, but Yankee women and New England women. I'd love you to talk a little bit about that, especially since we have some Concord graduates in the audience. But I'm also thinking about how that same push-pull, femininity, liberation, oppression worked itself out even in Concord Academy, though it looked very different.
I went to Concord Academy 3 days before my 13th birthday as a boarding student, and it just opened a world for me. I was always a really good student. In fact, just this week, I found in my office a dictionary that I was given in, I think, 4th grade. And you open it up, and it's Drew Gilpin, the Scholarship Prize, 4th grade. And there, I brought it home. I had to show it to my husband. Look. So I was, a very good student. I loved to read. I read incessantly. My 2nd grade report ends with a comment from the head of my school saying that he hoped I wouldn't read as much in the summer about to come as I had the preceding summer. Enough's enough. So I get to Concord Academy. It's a different world. It's a place that takes young girls. It was all girls at that point, I should say. But it took young girls with intellectual aspirations and excitement very seriously and challenged us and responded to our curiosity and our intellectual excitement about what we were doing. It was also a place run by women. There were a few male teachers there, but overwhelmingly women, and a particularly notable head of school named Elizabeth Hall, who could do anything, and we could see she could do anything. She drove a tractor to build a skating rink at the school. She took a old meeting house in New Hampshire with some assistants, other faculty members and so forth, but they dismantled this meeting house in New Hampshire and moved it board by board to the Concord Academy campus and then reassembled it as the Concord Academy Chapel. And there's a picture of her on a ladder with a hammer. This was not your usual head of a girls' boarding school. I got there in 1960, graduated in 64. She was unstoppable, strong. She gave marvelous speeches that inspired our moral core about who we ought to be and what we ought to do in the world. And we admired her extravagantly. But when I went back to read some of her speeches, they were inspiring. But there was also a kind of subtext, or not so subtext, throughout about how it's really men who make a way in the world. And we would be left to we'd be educated, but then we'd be left to the smaller things in life, and we should defer to our husbands. And it's not a competition between men and women, they're complementary, and we should not feel that we are the equivalent of men in any way. So at the same time she was modeling one kind of behavior, as we watched her, she was nevertheless completely enmeshed in the assumptions with which she'd been raised in the first half of the 20th century and what a lady should be. And she thought that's what we should be, but it was totally contradictory. And when I talked to people who went to Concord with me, I think almost all of us picked up on what she did rather than what she said in these messages about who young girls should be. And yet it was a puzzle that I think represents the confusion of messages to my generation of women.
Yeah, each generation has a different version of that struggle that you're talking about. It is great that you're here in March, which is Women's History Month, as we all know. And also, it's the anniversary of a sort of significant event, the Pettus Bridge incident. And I was so pleased. I always look for ghosts in books, memoirs, and the ghost here, it's a happy ghost, is John Lewis. So he is present from the cover all the way to the end. And I wonder if you would talk to us about your relationship and what meant for you.
So the title "Necessary Trouble" is a phrase borrowed from John Lewis. You may know more fully his good trouble, but he often followed it by not just make good trouble, make necessary trouble. And when I was writing this book, I was struck by the phrase and how apt it was for what I wanted to tell a story about, which was how I had to make trouble to survive. I had to get out of Virginia. I had to get out of that world that was stifling and unfair and blind to what I thought the most important values of the world ought to be. Now, John Lewis is someone who I had admired from the time I saw him having his head beaten in TV renditions of the Bloody Sunday March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I was so moved by seeing that on TV in March of 1965 that I cut my college freshman midterms and declined to finish my big paper for my freshman year and got in a car with my boyfriend and went to the march, the following march in Selma. And my parents never knew. They died before they ever knew I'd done that. And my boyfriend and I did this march because it was necessary. I felt, how can I live with myself having seen what was done to John Lewis as he marched for voting rights if I don't do something about it? And so I did. I met John Lewis on a personal basis much, much later. It was when I was president of Harvard. And I was asked to give a lecture for the NEH in Washington called the Jefferson Lecture and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The National Endowment for the Humanities invited John Lewis to read a poem before as a kind of warm-up act, I guess. When do you get John Lewis as a warm-up act, for heaven's sakes? But he read a beautiful poem, and then I thought he'd just leave, go back and do what he had to do. No, he walked over and he sat next to my husband, listened through the whole lecture, asked questions of my husband, came to the reception, took it so seriously. I was just so touched. And then there were a number of occasions that I interacted with him after that, perhaps most notably when he came to help dedicate the plaque that we put up on the Harvard president's residence that was built in the 18th century to commemorate 4 enslaved individuals who had worked in that house for 2 Harvard presidents. And we've been able to recover their names, and we were putting up a plaque in their memory, and he came and spoke. That was what was one of the most moving experiences I had as Harvard president. So when it came time for my last commencement in 2018, I asked him if he would give the commencement address, which he readily agreed to. And when he was beginning his remarks, you know how you greet people at the beginning of a speech, he turned to me and he said, "Madam President, thank you for making trouble necessary trouble." And he talked about the letter to Eisenhower. Yes. So when I got this idea that I would call this book Necessary Trouble, I thought, I have to ask John Lewis if it's okay. I don't know if I thought I needed his permission or his blessing or what exactly, but I knew I had to ask him. So I had a phone call with him just about 2 months before he died, and I asked if it was okay if I called my book Necessary Trouble. And he, being the most gracious human being you can imagine, said, of course, he would be honored, he'd be pleased. And so the book is called Necessary Trouble with permission, but also a little bit in honor of this remarkable man who I can hardly aspire to honor him. He honored himself by being so committed to his values, to the notion of a beloved community, to ever insisting that America could be better than it is. So that's the story of me and John Lewis.
Well, it's a lovely haunting, a lovely haunting. Sort of speaking of the beloved community and also going back to something you said a bit earlier, you're reflecting about how your own work, it grows out of your personal experience. You talk about white Southerners, privileged white Southerners. But you also grew up in war. Mm-hmm. And you write about war. Some might say your best book is Republic of Suffering. I don't know that the women's historians in the room would say that, but because Mothers of Men is pretty good. But Republic of Suffering was an amazing book. And you write around the Civil War, and we're telling, and you also taught in the Civil War. So what was the experience of growing up with war? And again, also to maybe say something about your attitude toward the violence that came out of the Civil Rights Movement.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think an important theme in this book, and maybe three pillars that exist to hold up the book, are World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not old enough to have lived through World War I, but my grandmother, who was very much a presence in my life in Virginia when I was growing up, did live through World War I. Growing up when she was a young woman, she was pretty grown up. She was born in 1894. So she was a young woman when World War I broke out. And her father, who was a West Point graduate from class of 1883, had been in the military, had left the military, but returned in his late 50s to command troops on the Western Front in World War I. He commanded a unit, a brigade, he was a brigadier general, a brigade of South Carolina and Tennessee National Guard, who were transformed into American troops, not just National Guard. And they fought bloody, horrible battles on the Western Front, really gruesome. As those of you who know about World War I know that America entered late, and the troops really weren't prepared for what they faced, and as a result, the carnage was extreme. And my grandmother's brother, her adored older brother, signed up to be a naval flyer. Now, this is a time when aviation is a kind of death trap, even if you don't add war to it. And so he was killed in October of 1918, just a month before the war ended. One of the extraordinary parts of this whole reconstruction that I was able to do from family letters and other records is how long it took information to get from where he was killed, not 100 miles away from where his father was serving. It took more than a week for him to find out. But it was just devastating for the family. So many hopes had been piled up on this young man. Mm-hmm. And my grandmother wrote to her father, and she said, "The wrong person has died. I should have been the one that died. The family name will not continue, and I know a girl isn't the same." And then she wrote later that after that loss, nothing was ever the same again. So she had just married. Her husband was also a flyer. He survived. But she came back and had my father just after this. Mm. But I posit that family life in that family was completely shaped by that experience of war and that experience of loss. And then she finds herself, a little more than 20 years later, seeing her sons go off to war again. So then there's my father's war, which is World War II. He was in Patton's Third Army. He landed on the beaches in France not long after the first wave of troops. His war was one in which he felt great satisfaction. This was the most important moment of his life. He wrote this again and again. And I think, okay, so you come back from the war, and you have me. My brother was already born. You have 2 more children. This is peacetime. And yet you continually write that the peak of your life had happened when you were in Patton's Third Army. Right. I think the distortions of my parents' marriage, of their relationship, of family life, the secrets my father had and never spoke about, so shaped our family growing up in ways not very different experiences. My father didn't die, his uncle did die, but in World War I. But nevertheless, the enormous impact of sending men off to war and the distortion that introduces into the world they come home to. So then I get to be of an age, late teenager, and there's Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And I become an avid anti-war protester. I'm, of course, a girl, which, as my grandmother said, isn't the same. I see all these young men being drafted around me when I'm in college, and the activism of that war really shaped my consciousness, and I think war has been a theme throughout my life and throughout my scholarship. And just to elaborate on something in a little more detail, there's a letter that I found that I wrote when I posted pictures on a Bryn Mawr College bulletin board of injured Vietnamese children. And some of my classmates came and took them down and said, "These are too horrible to look at." And I wrote this irate letter to the college newspaper saying, "This is your war, how can you say you're not looking at its fruits?" And I go on and on. And this letter is like a book prospectus for the book I wrote about death in the American Civil War 50 years later.
Yes.
And so when I read that letter, I thought, I've only had one idea, but I've sure held on to it. I could see this Republic of Suffering in my letter to the college newspaper written in 1967 about what the war in Vietnam meant to the people of Vietnam.
Oh, listen, it's a good one idea you had. Even you took a lot far, and thank you.
The idea is give peace a chance, I think, was what I
Yes.
was trying to say in those Vietnam years.
And that's what was attracting you to your civil rights work, was this idea of peaceful nonviolence. Mm-hmm. But and you were devoted. This is not, there's a trope. We talk about journeys through life. You do a lot of traveling in this book, and you traveled down south, and you were part of Freedom Summer. But at some point, the switch from peaceful nonviolence to violence did not sit well with you. Yeah.
So this really happened in both arenas of my college activism. The civil rights movement, it's often said that Selma was the high watermark of the civil rights movement and then was replaced by the Black Power movement, by the resort to violence on the, or at least holding violence in reserve as a possibility.
Yes.
Becomes infused within the Black Power movement. And essentially, white young people are not welcome in SNCC anymore. That's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the most forward-leaning civil rights organization. So the introduction of violence into racial dynamics and politics. And then with the Vietnam War movement, I had friends who got so frustrated. I was plenty frustrated, but I didn't follow their path, which was to go into the Weather Underground and other kinds of violent resistance to the Vietnam War. And I talk about a friend who did join I was quite close to her for some time, and she did join the Weather Underground and basically disappeared from view for a better part of a decade before she reemerged and led a quite extraordinary life. But this was a path that numbers of people in my college cohort chose to take. And for me, I think infused with Quaker values, I did a lot of these activities under Quaker auspices, but my commitment was always to nonviolence. And that's part of my admiration for John Lewis, was he remained to his dying day committed to the ideals of nonviolence.
Yeah, and I can see you pulling back when the violence begins. First as a defensive, well, we won't do anything but, and then translating. But if we're thinking about journeys as well, I would love you to talk about one that you took in high school that wasn't, I use this phrase advisedly, bananas. It was so idealistic, and this is going into the heart of the Cold War. And I love the ideals behind it, but it's just, and why your parents let you go.
That's a basic question. I think they weren't paying attention. I love your interpretation of my life as bananas. I think that's the best comment on my book. So in the summer of 1963, I joined a Quaker group that was traveling through the Iron Curtain to Eastern Europe. And this was the summer I very much wanted to do this. And why I wanted to do it, I think, was in part motivated by the Cuban Missile Crisis the preceding fall. And I can remember being at Concord Academy one night in October of 1962 and going into the classroom where my history class was usually held with a group of friends. We all sat on the desks and in semi-darkness and talked about how we thought the world was going to end the next day or two. And that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think you can say young women can tend to these extremes of emotion, the world's going to end. Well, looking back, it's amazing the world didn't end in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we were not being all that unrealistic. And we were talking about things in life that we'd never experienced, that we would be sad not to have experienced. And I came out of that thinking, somebody's got to do something about this. And I picked up later in the winter a flyer that talked about this Quaker-sponsored trip that would have young people from the West reach out across the Iron Curtain and meet with students in East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and talk about foundations of peace and how we might have hands across the Berlin Wall.
Yes.
And make peace possible at a time when the grown-ups around us seem to be making peace impossible. And so I set forth on this venture, and it had another notable aspect for me, which is we had 9 people on this trip, and 3 of them were African American. And I had never been in such close proximity and equality with African Americans before. And so that was something new and path-breaking for me, and revelatory, and pretty extraordinary young people, too. One had been one of the 9 young people, men, boys and girls, who had integrated the Atlanta public schools, for example, the 2 years before. So these models of excellence and commitment that my fellow travelers represented. So off we went through Checkpoint Charlie into Eastern Europe for a summer of conversation with young people who believed as fervently in communism as we believed in America. And it was eye-opening for me.
I know, it sounds amazing. And you at that time, I think you said that for you, freedom was a lot about what you can and cannot do. And what was it you said, the freedom to have?
I developed a new conception of what freedom might mean. And I would say to these young people in East Germany or Czechoslovakia, you don't have any freedom. You can't do this, do that, get hold of materials in the West. You can't, if you're in East Germany, you can't go to West Germany. The wall had been erected. Your liberties are curtailed. And then they said to me, but the state provides a job. I'm free to work. I'm free to get an education. I'm free to get medical care. And I thought, oh, this is a different idea of freedom. It's not freedom from, it's freedom to.
That's it, yeah.
And so they thought, I mean, they would argue, we have freedom, and then they describe it in that way. And that for me, I mean, maybe that's part of the empathy you were talking about. I thought, what an interesting way to see the world, and how can this inform how I understand the world better as I live my life on my side of the Iron Curtain?
Well, this is wonderful, and I'm having a great time, but we need to get the wisdom of the crowd here. So I have one last question, and it's one that I'm trying to introduce here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. As you know, we are dedicated here to the highest forms of research, and we support our researchers and our academics, but we're also really interested in public history, right? So this is any engagement that the public has with history, whether it's in a library or an archive, a museum, on a tour at the Freedom Trail. And so I do have a public history question for you, which is, of your scholarship, whether it's this book or your corpus, your body of scholarship, what would you like the public to know about what you've learned from your research?
I think that history is so important because it enables us to see that things could have been otherwise.
Yes.
And that inspires us to think that things can still be otherwise. And one of the hopes I've had for this book is that young people might read it and think things have changed and things can change again, but they don't change automatically. You have to make them change. And so as we contemplate what worlds of the past look like and we see the foreign country that they are, what can be otherwise as we contemplate the future? And how do we understand how we got here, obviously, but also how we're going to get there, wherever there might be. So that would be my hope for
that's pretty good.
engagement of students and the general public with history.
I like that. That's good. All right. Well, listen, we have, yeah, feel free to applaud. Thank you. Yes. Yes, you right ahead.
Thank you.
So we have Carol here with a microphone. Does anyone have a question? And I know, Olivia, we're going to look at questions online. Helen May and Bill Carlson there probably have some good questions online. Ah, I see somebody back there.
Hello, my name is Bill Kuhn. I enjoyed reading your book. I enjoyed the presentation. There was a memorable part of the book where I think you're head of student government at Bryn Mawr as an undergraduate, and you lead some student activism to get some rules changed at Bryn Mawr. And I think you're a thorn in the side of the Bryn Mawr administrators for whom you have some, maybe afterwards, some sneaking sympathy. And, and I'm just wondering how that would compare with your Harvard experience, where I remember at least one phase of your presidency where you say something about student radicals that there's no reason not to be polite here.
I said that?
I think you said that. Anyway, how would you compare and contrast those episodes?
I actually thought a lot about my student days as I lived my life as president of Harvard. And in particular, I thought about it in the kind of earliest emergence of student activism that had been pretty moribund when I became president. There hadn't been a lot of student uprisings and so forth. And then Occupy Wall Street happened. That was the first one. And I remember watching how the students were organizing this protest and thinking to myself, they don't know what they're doing. Thinking, if they did X, that would be much more successful. But I could anticipate to a certain extent how they might be thinking and strategizing. So I think my student experience put me in good stead. But I have to say that as a student activist, I was never impolite. I sort of thought universities ought to be places where we use reason. And so when students acted in ways that were confrontational without reason or without purpose even, I found that challenging. And I would try to return the interactions and disagreements to places where we could listen to each other and try to find common ground and move forward with common ground. But then I had to be strategic too. I remember one time students were going to occupy Mass Hall and we knew they were going to do it. So I had a plan in advance. The minute they did it, I would lock all the bathrooms. So they come with diapers. It's like,
You got to give it to them, Drew.
They outsmarted me on that one. But of course they ran out of diapers after a while, so then we had to talk.
Well, we need a handbook for revolution. Olivia, how are we doing in the virtual world here? Is there I'm sure there's a lot of good questions. Oh, a question about racism in Boston and implementing good trouble here in Boston.
Well, I was not here in the Boston area during the most intense time of schools and so forth. So I had gone on to college and had left. But an important thing that I do talk about in my book is coming to Concord Academy, which had all these ideals and expressed sympathy with the civil rights movement. And I got to go hear Martin Luther King speak at Groton School because Concord sent a bus to hear him speak. there was not a black student in my class. It was an entirely white school. And so it was a different kind of racial differentiation than the one I encountered and grew up with. And I think that the hearts were in a different place, but the actions had certainly not gotten to a place that we would recognize as anywhere close to acceptable. And it's kind of amazing in retrospect to think that in my lifetime, schools in New England, boarding schools, colleges even, were overwhelmingly white and segregated. So that's a very important part of the story. But in this book, I spent 4 years in New England, but the rest of it, really, I'm not. So there's a limited exposure to all this.
So let's see, do we have more questions? I have one right up here, Carol, in the front row here.
When we were involved in the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement in 1963 and came back to school at Yale, the faculty was very much non-supportive of what we had done. I think that may have happened at Harvard as well. I'm wondering whether you are aware of anything that took place like that, where the faculty turned against activism.
My experience, my college experience was at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. And when I decided I was going to Selma and cutting my midterm exams, I went to see my sociology professor, Eugene Schneider. And he said to me, I said, I'm going to cut your exam and I'm going to Selma. And if you feel you could give me a makeup based on that, I'd be grateful. But if you feel you can't, that I understand. So I think he gave me a makeup, but I can't remember that. But he said to me, do your parents know you're going? I said, of course not. You know, they wouldn't let me go. He said, I want you, and I was 17 years old. So probably he did some illegal thing by not reporting me immediately to the college administration. He said, while you're down there, I want you to call me every 24 hours. And if you don't, I'm going to call out the cavalry. And I said, what's the cavalry? And he said, we'll see if it comes to that. So I did what he asked, and the day of the march itself, we arrived, we drove all night to Atlanta, then we drove the next morning to Selma, then we joined the marchers at Brown Chapel and went off on the march, and suddenly the day was over, and I hadn't called Eugene Schneider. And I sort of thought, is the cavalry coming? What's going on? And I said to a woman who was from the community who'd been walking with me that day, I said, would you make a collect call to this number and this man's, no cell phones, of course. And so Eugene Schneider accepted the charges and didn't call out the cavalry. But I just tell that story as an example of tremendous sympathy. I think other faculty members who knew I'd done this, my English professor for whom I'd not written a decent paper, which I'd spent all semester supposedly writing, his comments on my paper are included here, and they're just magnificent. He's so appalled. He says, I sympathize with your decision to go to Selma, but this has wreaked havoc on your paper. And then he goes on and on and on about all the shortcomings of my paper. But I think they were sympathetic. They just thought I ought to take the music or at least the English professor did. The sociology professor wanted to take care of me on some level, not stop me. Interesting, not stop me, but watch out for me. So I think Bryn Mawr College, Quaker-infused place, a place that believed in strong women and their commitment to independent lives, gave me a lot of support for becoming an independent woman. So I'm very glad I went to Bryn Mawr College.
And I love this story when you're on your way to Selma and you need a little break. You need to stop to rest. Would you care to share that story? Because it's really quite lovely.
So we were driving to Selma and we were exhausted and we thought we just got to sleep. And we were quite aware that outside agitators were being scrutinized in the South and people with northern license plates, and you must have had this experience for sure. And so we were kind of nervous about where could we go that would be safe. And I was too young. We couldn't check into a motel. I was 17 years old. You know, the Mann Act would have been a possibility. It was illegal for me to be traveling with this boyfriend. So maybe we were being overly cautious, but I don't think entirely, given the kinds
No,
of
I agree.
ways that northern interlopers were being treated. So I'd spent some time in Atlanta the preceding summer when I'd been doing civil rights work and with the Quakers in the South. And I kind of knew my way around Atlanta well enough to find my way to Morehouse College, where we'd spent a lot of time the preceding summer. And so we drove to Morehouse College and drove into a parking lot and decided we'd just go to sleep. And this security guard came over and banged, we were asleep, maybe an hour later, whatever, bangs on the window. What are you doing here? What are you doing here? Why are you parked here? And we rolled down the window and we said, we're going to Selma. And he said, bless you, went off. So that was lovely too.
Lovely. I think we have time for one more question. So I'll give the room a chance before we turn to the internet. I think we have a...
How did your parents feel about the civil rights movement as it unfolded?
About the civil rights movement?
Yes.
They thought that the traditional racial arrangements of the South should remain in place. They lived in a segregated world, expected the world to remain segregated. I mean, they weren't Ku Klux Klan members or anything, but they very much accepted the mores of the South as they existed. They were conservatives. My father voted for Eisenhower and voted for Goldwater and politics that diverged quite dramatically from my own, maybe when I was 9.
And it wasn't generational because your brothers were not necessarily compelled by any of the issues, it seems like.
Well, it's interesting. I think my brothers just didn't see these issues as foregrounded for them.
Right.
But my older brother, who remained in, he's almost like a different generation. He's class of 65 at Princeton. There was one African American in his Princeton class of 1965. And so he had an even more traditional surround than
Right.
I did. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll began to happen as I was growing up. But he has remained in Virginia as a lawyer. He's extremely active in the NAACP. Racial justice is the meaning of his life at age 80. And he's on a committee of the Protestant Episcopal Church to figure out what to do with the $10 million in reparations that the Virginia Episcopal Church has designated.
Yeah.
So I think that I just want to say he is very much an activist of a later arrival than mine. But
Learned from his sister. There you go. Well, I want to say that as we're getting ready to go, this is just a terrific book. And this is the way I wanted to end this program, and I didn't have the courage to do it. But there's a lot of revolution in here, and there's a lot of dancing. And there is a moment when you are waiting to cross Checkpoint Charlie or something crazy like that, where you all start doing a dance called the hitchhike. And there is actually a picture of her with all of her friends doing the hitchhike, and I could just picture it. And my fondest wish was we would have queued up the music, but I just couldn't do that to you. Just couldn't do it. But I want you to know that I wanted it. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.